February 1987. Levittown, New York. The house looks ordinary. A split level on a quiet street. Curtains drawn. A station wagon in the driveway. Inside, a woman sits at a kitchen table. She hasn't slept in 3 days. There are no men with guns outside, no unmarked cars, no wiretaps humming beneath the floorboards. The danger is already inside. Her name is Karen Hill. And the most terrifying thing in her life is not the mob. It's the silence. Her husband is gone. Not dead, not arrested. Gone in the way that men like Henry Hill disappear, sideways, into the arms of another woman, into the comfort of cocaine, into a world that had already begun consuming itself from within. The FBI will later describe Henry Hill as one of the most valuable informants in the history of organized crime. They will celebrate his cooperation. They will relocate his family under the Federal Witness Protection Program. What they will not document, what no government file will ever fully capture, is what happened to Karen. Not the glamour, not the fur coats or the to-the-front-of-the-line restaurants. What happened after? The psychological dismantling of a woman who had been shaped entirely by a criminal world and then abandoned inside it. This is not the story Hollywood told you. This is the one they left on the cutting room floor. She was not born into this world. She was recruited by it. Karen Friedman grew up in the suburbs of New York, Woodmere, Long Island. A Jewish household. Middle class, stable, by every conventional measure. Her father worked. Her mother kept the home. The neighborhood was the kind where people mowed lawns on Saturdays and didn't ask too many questions about anyone else's business. It was, by every definition, the opposite of the world she would enter. But here is what the film never examined, and what Karen herself would later articulate in her own memoir. She was not naive. She was not a victim of ignorance. She knew, early, that Henry Hill was connected. She saw it in the way men deferred to him, in the way restaurants rearranged themselves around his presence, in the way money appeared without explanation and problems disappeared without discussion. She chose it, consciously, at 17 years old. That choice is the thesis of everything that follows. Because the machinery of organized crime does not only corrupt the men inside it, it colonizes the people who love them. It restructures their instincts, what feels like danger, what feels like safety, what feels like love. By the time Karen married Henry in 1965, she had already begun the psychological recalibration that life in the mob demands of its women. Loyalty above evidence, silence above truth. Presence without knowledge, or more precisely, knowledge carefully never spoken aloud. She was 20 years old. She was not passive. She was, in many ways, precisely what that world required. And that is the tragedy the glamour conceals. There is no orientation, no rule book, no moment where someone sits you down and explains the terms. You learn by absorption. Karen Hill learned that when Henry came home late, you did not ask where he had been. You learned that the money in the envelope on the kitchen counter had no origin you were permitted to trace. You learned that certain men were greeted with embraces and certain men were never mentioned by name. You learned the geography of silence, which rooms to leave when conversations began, which phone calls to forget you had heard. This was not weakness. In the context of that world, it was a form of mastery. By the late 1960s, Henry Hill was a full earner operating under the protection of the Lucchese crime family. He was not a made man. His mixed Irish-Sicilian heritage permanently barred him from that distinction. But he was productive, connected, and dangerous enough to operate with significant autonomy. And Karen existed at the center of that orbit. She socialized with the wives of made men. She attended dinners where the conversation never touched the actual business being conducted across those tables. She raised children in homes purchased with money that had passed through enough hands to become, officially, untraceable. What this life provided was real. The financial insulation. The social hierarchy. The sensation, and it was a sensation, not an illusion, of being protected by something larger than conventional society could offer. But protection in that world is always conditional. It does not love you back. It merely tolerates your proximity, until proximity becomes liability. Karen would spend nearly 2 decades learning the precise location of that line. Every criminal organization contains within it the precise mechanism of its own destruction. In Henry Hill's case, that mechanism had a name. It was cocaine. Through the 1970s, the Lucchese family had issued an internal prohibition against drug trafficking. The reasoning was pragmatic, not moral. Narcotics convictions carried federal sentences of a magnitude that made men talk, and men who talked brought down structures that had survived decades of law enforcement pressure. Henry ignored this. He ignored it because cocaine was extraordinarily profitable. He ignored it because, by this point, he was also consuming it. And he ignored it because men like Henry Hill had always operated under the private conviction that consequences applied to everyone but themselves. This is where the story of Karen Hill diverges most sharply from the version Hollywood presented. While Henry expanded his narcotics operation, eventually connecting to the infamous 1978 Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport, one of the largest cash robberies in American history, he was simultaneously dismantling his marriage with the same recklessness he applied to everything else. The other woman was not a secret. Her name was Robin Cooperman. Henry installed her in an apartment. He spent holidays with her. He brought her into spaces that had previously belonged to Karen. Karen's response has been documented, a confrontation, direct and physical, that demonstrated she had absorbed more than silence from her years inside that world. She had absorbed its glamour of power. She understood that passivity was not survival. But the structure was collapsing regardless. Henry's cocaine use was now visible to the people who mattered most, not his family, but his associates. A man whose judgment is chemically compromised is a man who cannot be trusted with information. And in organized crime, a man who cannot be trusted with information becomes, very quickly, a liability. By 1980, Henry Hill was being watched, not only by the FBI, by his own people. The danger that had always existed outside the home had finally turned inward, and Karen Hill stood at the center of it, aware, clear-eyed, and running out of exits. The federal government does not approach informants with compassion. It approaches them with architecture. By 1980, the FBI had been constructing its case around the Lucchese family's operations for years. The Lufthansa heist had accelerated that pressure considerably. 6 figures had been stolen from an airport cargo facility in broad operational daylight. The embarrassment to law enforcement was significant. The political will to dismantle the network responsible was, consequently, absolute. Henry Hill was not their primary target. He was their instrument. What followed was a carefully calibrated campaign of pressure, arrests, bail conditions, the systematic demonstration to Henry that the walls were closing and that the only architecture capable of protecting him now belonged to the federal government, not to the Lucchese family. In May 1980, Henry Hill was arrested on narcotics charges. The case was substantial, the exposure was severe, and the men who might previously have provided legal insulation, the lawyers, the bondsmen, the quiet interventions that organized crime extends to its productive members, were no longer extending that courtesy to a man whose cocaine habit had made him a structural risk. He was, in the language of that world, already dead. The paperwork simply hadn't been filed yet. What is rarely examined is what this moment demanded of Karen. The FBI's approach to her was not incidental. Agents understood that Karen Hill represented a specific kind of leverage, not because she was weak, but because she was rational. She had children. She had absorbed years of exposure to a world that was now preparing to consume her husband entirely. She understood, with the clarity that survival instincts produce, that loyalty to Henry Hill no longer carried any practical return. She was not coerced into supporting his cooperation. She was presented with an architecture of consequences and asked to choose within it. This is the political dimension that documentary accounts consistently underweight. The Federal Witness Program is not merely a legal instrument. It is a mechanism of social erasure, deployed not only against criminals, but against the entire ecosystem that sustains them. Wives, children, extended networks of association. Karen Hill did not simply agree to let her husband become a government witness. She agreed to the annihilation of the only world she had ever fully inhabited. That is a different kind of decision entirely. It is not grief. It is not poverty. It is the loneliness of a person who has been extracted from the only context in which they made sense and deposited into a world that has no category for what they are. This is what witness protection actually is, beneath the bureaucratic language of relocation and identity reassignment. It is a sentence, served by people who committed no indictable crime. When the Hill family entered the Federal Witness Protection Program in 1980, they were given new names, new addresses, and a federal stipend that bore no relationship to the financial reality they had previously inhabited. They were moved repeatedly: Nebraska, Washington State, Kentucky, Ohio, each relocation triggered by Henry's inability to remain invisible. His addictions traveled with him. His instincts traveled with him. The federal government was attempting to change the geography of a man whose problems were entirely internal. Karen moved each time. She rebuilt each time. And each time, Henry dismantled it. But the deeper betrayal was not Henry's. It was structural. The women of the mob, the wives, the companions, the mothers of children raised inside that world, occupy a position that organized crime has always exploited with precision. They are granted proximity to power without formal membership. They absorb the risks of the life without the corresponding protections the life extends to its actual members. And when the structure collapses, they are categorized by law enforcement not as victims but as peripheral figures, useful for context, disposable thereafter. Karen Hill had spent 2 decades operating as an essential component of a machine that never acknowledged her as a working part. Now that machine was gone. And the government that had disassembled it regarded her with bureaucratic indifference. The women she had known, the wives of Lucchese associates, the social network that had constituted her entire adult world, were now unreachable by design. Contact with former associates was prohibited under the terms of protection. The friendships, the rituals, the shared glamour of that life, all of it severed, formally and permanently. She was 40 years old. She was in a city she had not chosen. She was married technically to a man who was now a federal asset and a functioning addict. And she was entirely alone in a way that no relocation package addresses. Chapter 7. The Execution, Not Death. Erasure. The mob does not always kill you with a bullet. Sometimes it kills you with a signature. In 1984, Karen Hill filed for divorce. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final act of violence, no moment of operatic resolution. There was a legal document, processed through a court in a state she had not grown up in, under a name that was not her own, dissolving a marriage that had already been hollowed out from within over the preceding decade. By every external measure, it was unremarkable. By every internal measure, it was the end of an identity. This is the execution the film never showed. Not Henry's betrayal of his associates, not the FBI debriefings, not the relocation, the quiet administrative termination of a woman's entire constructed self, the final consequence of a choice made at 17 years old on a suburban Long Island street. Consider what Karen Hill lost in precise terms. She lost financial security. The federal stipend was modest, irregular, and attached to Henry's continued cooperation, which was itself attached to Henry's continued sobriety, which was never reliable. She lost social infrastructure. Every relationship she possessed, had been routed through a world she could no longer access. She lost geographical identity. She had been moved so many times that the concept of home had become functionally meaningless. And she lost narrative. This is the loss that receives the least attention and carries the most weight. Inside the mob, Karen Hill had a story. She was someone's wife. She occupied a position within a hierarchy that, however brutal, provided coherent meaning. The rules were clear. The rewards were tangible. The identity was stable, if constructed on unstable ground. Outside it, she was a woman in her 40s with children, a federal file number, and a past she was legally and practically prohibited from discussing. The organized crime world performs a specific psychological operation on the people embedded within it. It does not merely provide income or protection. It provides an entire interpretive framework for existence, a way of understanding power, loyalty, safety, and self. When that framework is removed, the person inside it does not simply adjust. They must reconstruct the architecture of meaning from the foundation. Most people never receive the tools for that reconstruction. Karen Hill received a new name and a bus ticket. Chapter 8. Aftermath and Fallout. Witness Protection and What It Cost. The Federal Witness Protection Program was designed to preserve lives. It was not designed to preserve the people living them. By the mid-1980s, Henry Hill had been relocated multiple times, arrested multiple times, and removed from the program at least once for narcotics violations. The government that had extracted him from organized crime was now managing the consequences of his addiction with the same bureaucratic exhaustion it applied to everything else. Karen was managing them personally. What emerged from this period, documented partially in Karen's own memoir, published in 2004, and in subsequent interviews she gave, with a frankness that the film adaptation never captured, was a portrait of institutional abandonment that runs parallel to, and in many ways mirrors, the abandonment she experienced within the criminal world itself. The pattern is precise enough to be instructive. Inside the mob, Karen had been protected conditionally, her security entirely dependent on Henry's standing within a hierarchy that could withdraw its approval without notice. Inside witness protection, her security was equally conditional, dependent on Henry's cooperation, his sobriety, his continued value to federal prosecutors who had their own institutional priorities entirely disconnected from her welfare. In both cases, she was a dependent variable in an equation written entirely by men. The children absorbed the consequences in ways that were quieter and therefore more permanent. Raised under false names in unfamiliar cities, educated in schools where their histories could not be spoken, they inhabited a specific kind of childhood dislocation that produces adults who struggle to locate themselves within any stable narrative of identity. This is the generational cost that organized crime extracts most silently. Not the violence visited upon enemies, not the corruption of institutions, but the psychological inheritance passed to children who never chose the life and were never given the means to leave it cleanly. Henry Hill was eventually removed from witness protection permanently. He rebuilt a public identity around his own story, interviews, cookbooks, paid appearances. He monetized the narrative. Karen rebuilt in silence. She worked. She raised her children. She constructed, piece by piece, an existence that owed nothing to the world that had shaped and then discarded her. It was, by any honest assessment, the more difficult achievement, and it received a fraction of the cultural attention, because the culture that consumes organized crime stories is drawn to the spectacle of the men, their violence, their codes, their downfall. The women who inhabited those same structures, absorbed those same risks, and survived those same collapses are treated as atmospheric detail, supporting characters in someone else's confession. Return for a moment to that kitchen table. Levittown, 1987. The curtains drawn, the silence, It was never really about Henry. Henry Hill was a mechanism, a specific product of a specific environment, predictable in his appetites, predictable in his betrayals, predictable in his eventual collapse. The FBI understood this. The Lucchese family understood this. Karen, by the end, understood this better than anyone. What Karen Hill's story reveals is something the organized crime documentary genre has spent decades carefully avoiding. The mob does not sustain itself through violence alone. Violence is its punctuation. Its actual grammar is constructed from something far more durable, the systematic cultivation of people who will absorb its costs without formal membership in its rewards. Women like Karen Hill were not peripheral to that structure. They were load-bearing walls. They maintained the domestic architecture that allowed criminal operations to function with the appearance of normalcy. They raised children inside a value system that prioritized loyalty to the group above accountability to the law. They processed, emotionally and practically, the consequences of decisions they were never formally consulted about. And when the structure finally collapsed, under the weight of federal prosecution, internal betrayal, or simple entropy, they were left holding the debris. This is not a story unique to the American mob. It is a story embedded within every hierarchical criminal organization across every culture and every era that produced them. The Camorra in Naples, the Yakuza in Osaka, the Triads in Hong Kong. The specific details vary. The architecture of female expendability remains remarkably consistent. What changed for Karen Hill, what makes her case instructive rather than merely tragic, is that she survived it consciously. She did not romanticize what had been done to her. Her memoir is not a nostalgia document. It is an accounting, precise, unsentimental, delivered without the self-pity that would have made it easier to dismiss. She understood that she had made choices. She understood the weight those choices carried, and she refused to allow the cultural mythology surrounding her husband's story to substitute for the truth of her own. That is a form of courage that requires no violence to demonstrate. There is a philosophical question embedded in every organized crime story that the genre rarely pauses long enough to ask. Not whether the criminal deserved his fate, not whether law enforcement was justified in its methods, but this: what does a society reveal about itself when it constructs entire mythologies around the men who broke its rules and renders invisible the women who survived the consequences? Henry Hill died in 2012. He received obituaries in major newspapers. His story had been told in a celebrated film, in countless interviews, in a cultural vocabulary that made his name immediately recognizable. Karen Hill is still alive. Her name requires a moment of recollection. That asymmetry is not accidental. It is the final, most honest expression of exactly the same value system that organized crime itself operates on. Power determines whose story gets told, and the women who carried those worlds on their backs, who made the coffee, raised the children, kept the silence, absorbed the violence, survived the erasure, and rebuilt without applause, are still waiting for the documentary that treats their experience as the center of the story. Not the aftermath, not the footnote, the story itself.